So I'm back in the forest that I was doing my last video in, and yesterday I came through with the family and I came across finally the fungi that I was hoping to photograph in the previous video. So I'm back again, and this time I'm going to look at the process to which you actually do your panoramic shots. Now my idea when I saw this photograph and I first tested it with a phone was to create a photograph with the light coming down on top of these fungus that have emerged from this wet log and have an out of focus background behind me, or at least going off into the distance where you can see the path. So the basic principle is get your composition first. So I've used a phone and also my own eyes to pre-visualize the photograph. Then set up your tripod once you've got your composition right. Setting up the tripod, make sure that you have a level base, which I've done using the LS324CEX Leo Photo tripod, so that I've got a level base for my camera to rotate on. Then I'm going to add my NR200 rail, and you've got to be aware of the fact over here as well, that if you've got a very short lens, the rail might intrude into your photograph itself. I'm shooting with a DSLR, so that's less of a problem. Once I've got my rail on and my camera set up, you then want to make sure that your camera is level as well, and you'll do this using the leveling on the live view or the internal level inside some cameras' viewfinders. You've got to make sure that the camera is also level over here, for the simple fact that if you're using a ball head and you tilt it over to the side ever so slightly, there's no point in having actually used the leveling base on the tripod itself in the first place. Once you've got that set up, then you take your photographs. Everything has to be set to manual. It's manual exposure, manual focus, manual white balance, manual, the whole way. You don't want to have anything auto, because every photograph has to be absolutely identical from an exposure point of view. The general consensus is that there needs to be about a third overlap between the images, but really if you're using a rig where you're actually looking for your nodal point, or at least the optical center of the lens like I've done by bringing it back on the rail, then you no longer need to worry that much about having a third overlap. You can actually do slightly less and get more stitch in your photographs. The reason for the third is that if you don't actually have a rig like I've used here, where you have the camera set back and that you have the optical center of the lens being the rotation point, the third allows any parallax issues to be dealt with by the stitching software. So at any rate, it is good practice to do a third, but if you've got a system where you can move the camera back and you can look for the optical center of the lens, then it's less important, but you still need to have some overlap. Okay, so make sure you do have some overlap.
A number of camera manufacturers produce indexed rotating pan bases, which basically allow you to set the degree increments so that you can take a photograph, move it exactly 20 or 35 degrees, take another photograph, then move it exactly another 20 or 25 degrees, or whatever you've set it at.
Again, it's not necessary. You don't have to worry about that in my personal experience. So I just rotate and I use visual line of sight basically to work out whether I have gone to a third overlap or not. And that's it. That's really, really, really simple. The last video I did get quite a few people saying, no, this can't work. Well, the surprising thing is, it does. Having the system so that it is rotating on a central axis of the lens itself allows for fantastic single row panoramas. Now I'm not interested in doing a double row stitch over here. I'm shooting with a 45 megapixel camera with a wide angle lens. I've got tons of pixels. I don't need any more, so I'm not going to need to do the double row stacking. If on the other hand, you want to do a photograph where you've got multiple rows that you're going to stitch together, then it becomes important to use an actual panoramic head, which is essentially giving you your nodal point not only on an x-axis but also on the y-axis, so that you can rotate 360 degrees and the central optics of the lens stays in the same place all the time. The reason I don't like those rigs is they're complicated, they're very, very heavy, and they're expensive. Now, if I'm going to be hiking 20 kilometers into the mountains, I don't want to have a big, heavy setup. I want my tripod and I want a rail. That's it for my single row panoramic stitches. So if you want great panoramic stitches that are single row, all you need is a leveling base on your tripod and some kind of plate or nodal plate or clamp that's going to bring the camera back so that you can measure where your central point is. Okay, from here we're going to go into the studio where I will continue this going into Capture One Pro, and I'm going to stitch it together in and produce the photograph.
Okay, so I'm now back in the studio after a little walk in the forest, and I'm now going to put the images together using Capture One Pro. The process I'm going to use, of course, is with Capture One Pro, since that's the editing software that I personally prefer. But you can use the same process and workflow in Lightroom or Photoshop or some of the other programs that allow for panoramic stitching as well. So I have my images in front of me at the moment in the gallery mode in Capture One, and the images I particularly like are the ones that I shot in vertical format. So in other words, 4 images, single row stitch, vertical format so that I've got a bit of width, and I'm going to use my shortcut keys that I already have built in, which is Shift Command M, or you can just right click and you can say stitch to panorama. I'm going to hit Shift Command M though, and wait for it to stitch, and at the moment I have it set to perspective. Bear in mind that if you haven't used a nodal rail, there's a good chance that using the perspective option is actually going to fail. It just can't seem to warp everything together effectively. By trying to find the optical center of the image, there's a good chance that perspective is actually going to work. And even if you miss it a little bit, there's a better chance that perspective is going to work. So there it is as it is immediately. You've got a nice wide angle view. The perspective, which is trying to simulate what would have occurred if I'd had an ultra wide lens, is obviously stretching the corners of the image as well. If I wanted to make it so that it was compensating for that, I could go to Panini, for instance, and it would generate a panoramic that looks more like you've warped it into place as if you've got this linear perspective, straightening up my verticals, for instance. So both of them work quite well. I'm going to stick with perspective as I think it gives me the wider angle feel, because that's what I was going for with the image itself. I specifically shot it with a wide aperture because I wanted to throw the background out of focus. I'm going to stitch that now, and I'm just going to, you can see that the image itself is going to end up at 16,984 pixels on the long side. I'm going to crop that in quite significantly because I'm using the perspective warp over there, but that's fine. I've shot with enough detail inside that. When the image comes through, you can actually jump through to the metadata, so you can now see that the file is 16,984 by 13,539 pixels. A lot of those pixels, though, are wasted pixels because of the black surround around it, which we're going to crop out. So at any rate, that is my master image. From there, what I would then do is crop into the file that I would like it to look like. So I'm going to go into my crop tool. I prefer cropping in unconstrained, so I'm going to just bring this in so that I can see exactly what my file would have looked like. I'm going to bring this in a little bit on the left as well, and I'm going to bring it on the right. So the whole concept behind the photograph was to be able to get this feeling that there's these mushrooms in the foreground with this wet wood in the back, or sorry, wet forest in the background with the path coming through on the right hand side. There is a small error which some of you might have already picked up on, and it was one of the issues that I had shooting using a tripod that doesn't have a center column. If I'd had a center column with an added leveling base on it, I could have actually hung it from the top of the tripod with the tripod legs fully extended and actually had it suspended underneath the tripod. Because I was working in kind of a confined forest floor setting, I have ended up getting a little bit of a tripod leg inside there. That's not very hard to clone out though, so I'm going to just heal it out. So there's my base image, very nicely, easily stitched. So what I would then do is continue into my adjust section, and I'm going to just work the photograph ever so slightly by bringing up my exposure a little bit. I can brighten up or bring in my white point slightly, and to get that feel that I had earlier on of the darker surrounds, I want to add a vignette. So I'm just adding the vignette in the background over there. And the other thing that really bugged me was when I originally walked through that forest, there was light spilling through from the background. Because of the overcast conditions, I didn't have that. So I'm now going to simulate that by creating a radial tool. I'm going to bring that in so that you can see it overlooking the pathway itself. I'm going to make it relatively large. Now remember, this is a rough edit, and I'm going to just increase the exposure there with the contrast and add some more warmth to it. And let's also bring in those highlights a little bit. That's it. And we want to just feather that out so that you can see it almost coming in from the background over there. To keep things nicely ordered, I'm going to rename that layer as my, let's call it incoming light. And my base layer, I'm also going to just quickly bring down my temperature just a little bit and bring back some of that green, which I've lost slightly through the magenta of the photograph itself. Okay, so that's a very, very, very basic edit at the moment. I could continue further to get to something like this, which is essentially another 5 or 7 minutes of editing to be able to get that. The critical thing about creating these panoramic images is that they don't need to be complicated. You don't need a bucket load of equipment to be able to produce perfectly usable panoramics. You don't even need the nodal rail. However, if you are going to be photographing close-ups like I've shot over here, or photographs where there are more angles involved in the photo, having the nodal rail or nodal clamp, or just a rail that's going to get your camera back and the optical center aligned over the rotation point of the camera, you're going to get far better results. As with anything to do with photography, there are 101 other ways in order to achieve this same result. You can put some of these ideas down in the comments section below if you would like. I'm always on the lookout for new options that are out there. But as I mentioned, the reason I don't use a large panoramic rig like the ones available from Really Right Stuff, Leo Photo, Nodal Ninja, etc., etc., is that they are big, they're heavy, and they are complicated to use. And although I have used them in the past, if I'm going to go hiking out in the woods, I don't want to have to carry an extra 2 kilograms just to be able to take a photograph. Your mileage may vary, of course. Possibly you are photographing waterfalls where you are stacking with a long lens multiple rows of images, in which case using a full panoramic rig makes a lot more sense. But if you're doing something simple like what I'm shooting over here, a single row panorama, often with up-close details, this is one of the easiest ways to get around the parallax problem, which I described in the video over here, and creating panoramics that are immersive and draw you in. Once again, thanks for watching. I hope to see you again. I have another Capture One video in the pipeline coming up, as well as another Leo Photo tripod on creating your own bespoke monster tripod. So subscribe if you'd like to get those notifications, and hopefully catch you again on the next one. Cheers.